Um, I'll just very briefly introduce her to you. Professor Ruba Salih is the professor of anthropology at the Department of Arts, University of Bologna. She received her PhD in socioanthropology from the University of Sussex in the year 2000. She taught in the Gender and Middle East Studies at the Institute of Arab and Islamic Studies at the University of Exeter in the UK from 2007 to 2010, and at the University of Bologna. Then in 2010 to 2022, at SOAS in London in the Department of Gender Studies and the Department of Anthropology and Sociology. Her research interests and publications cover transnational migration and diasporas across Europe, the Middle East, and North Africa, Islam and gender, the Palestine question, and refugees, trauma, and conflict in the Middle East. She was selected a member of the Board of Trustees of the Arab Council of the Social Sciences from 2015 to 2019 and has held visiting positions at Brown, Cambridge, and Venice. Her books include Gender in Transnationalism, Home, Longing, and Belonging Among Moroccan Migrant Women, and a book in Italian, I believe, called Musulman Rivelate Don Islam Modernità. She's at present working on a book on the aesthetics of waiting and the politics of return among Palestinian refugees. She also co-edited special issues with Sophie Richter Devereux on Palestine and self-determination beyond national frames, emerging politics, cultures, and claims in the journal South Atlantic Quarterly in 2018, and Cultures of Resistance in Palestine and Beyond on the politics of arts, aesthetic, and affect in the Arab Studies Journal in 2014. Her other most recent articles include Displacing the Anthropocene, Colonization, Extinction, and the Unruliness of Nature in Palestine with Olaf Curry, and in the journal Environment and Planning E, Nature and Space in 2021. And also From Standing Rock to Palestine, We Are United, Diaspora Politics, Decolonization, and the Intersectionality of Struggles with Elena Zambelli and Lynn Welchman in the journal Ethnic and Racial Studies in 2020. 2 days ago, she submitted a revised abstract of her talk. So instead of my reading it, I'll just let her introduce the topic. So let's welcome Professor Salih.
I couldn't hear very much, but I trust that Professor Chun has introduced me with all the relevant news, but I'm sorry I couldn't hear any of what was being told. First of all, I want to thank the organizer for inviting me and apologize for not being there in person. I'm sure I'm missing a lot of really interesting and engaging discussions, and it's really a pity that I have to share my thoughts via a screen. I hope you can all hear me.
Yes.
Yeah, okay. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to share my screen, and hopefully.
对，他自己讲，刚刚讲，我们不用做模糊，我先拿这个嘛，看那边。
So, okay. So, as you can see, the title of my talk today has slightly changed, although I promise not to deviate too much from the provided abstract that was provided a few months ago. So what I'm going to talk to you about today is what I call borrowing from a notion by Gerald Wiesenor, a Native American scholar who coined this notion of survivance, to denote, as I will talk about later the relationship or the tension that exists between surviving and resisting. So what I'm going to talk about is survivance and decolonial politics, and focus on Palestine as what I consider a central knot in the reconfiguration of assemblages of power today. So I'm going to talk about Palestine as more than metaphor, and obviously what I mean is going to become clear as I go on. First of all, let me explain the reason for this cute, but more than cute actual picture that I chose as the kind of iconic picture of my talk today. So on October 12, 2016, skybird black owl gave birth to a baby at Standing Rock in the camp erected to protest against the Dakota Access Pipeline project, which many of you might have, of course, heard about, which was considered the pipeline to violate indigenous sovereignty and to endanger the region's water resources. So in media portraits, the baby appears wrapped in traditional Native American patterns cloths, but is also highly visible in the portrait is a Palestinian kufiya draped around the cloth. So this image, which I'm going to come back to in different ways, is, I think, highly evocative of what I would like to call a politics of presence, where Palestine has become more than a metaphor, or more than a symbol as well, for an emergent resistant politics and its specific attendant languages, aesthetics, and tactics. And as I will try to elaborate on later, it has become, and these kind of pictures and protests point to a process of a generative, radical intersectional struggle and global social justice movements, where Palestine features as central in multiple ways. So, why is this not moving? Okay. Well, we don't want to be stuck with this picture, although it's really a nice one, but for some reason, okay. So in this talk, basically what I'm trying to do is to bring together various strands from my recent work and try and sort of reflect together on what these various strands have meant for my own engagement with decolonizing or decolonial politics. So I'm trying to bring together in this frame of decolonial thinking three main kind of lines of investigation that have characterized my work in recent years. The first is sort of a major reflection that has accompanied my ethnographic work and my publications and my research over the last few years, which is concerned with investigating or reflecting on the limits of the national as a paradigm for thinking liberation, particularly but not exclusively in Palestine. And the second strand has to do with a reflection which has appeared on a couple of publications, recent publications, on the ongoing operations of and the nature and operations of settler colonialism in Palestine, Israel, particularly as it regards the relationship or the sort of the disciplining of the relationship between life and non-life, or indigenous life and non-life. And finally, a third strand, which is concerned with a study or a reflection on what I've just suggested, which is the repositioning of Palestine as in global justice struggles. That is to say, Palestine or the Palestine question no longer simply understood as a liberation movement or a national liberation movement, better to say, but as a central knot in sort of what Angela Davis, as I will argue later, has called the intersectionality of struggles. So some reason. So let me start with the first strand, which is stemming from an edited collection that I put together with a colleague, and that has featured several contributions that aimed at investigating precisely what I just suggested. So that is to say, the limits of the national, which could be also seen as the limits of the nation state as a horizon for thinking about liberation. And the reason why this is important is because as Palestinians and as scholars of Palestine, we have been experiencing what I would define as a cognitive and experiential dissonance with a nation state that since the so-called peace agreement or the Oslo agreement of the early 90s, with the coming into existence of a sort of Palestine entity or sovereign entity, to use a kind of euphemism, has meant that we have experienced a sort of a nation state which is not yet fully realized and is already mutilated at the outset. As many, of course, have argued, the Oslo peace process reformulated rather than ended Zionist colonization. And obviously, this meant that this has undermined the possibility of a viable Palestinian state, Israel's continuous war and the siege of Gaza, the presence of over 600,000 Israeli Jewish settlers in the West Bank, including East Jerusalem, the more than 700-kilometer separation wall, and the institutionalization of over 99 Israeli checkpoints within what is considered to be the Palestinian sort of semi-sovereign autonomous entity or region or territory, has ended up destroying the idea of a two-state solution, which was long considered also the only option for ending the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And what we've seen on the ground is basically the birth of a sort of entity that is conveniently referred to as a state or a sort of national kind of outfit for Palestinian sovereignty, but which has none of the characteristics of an independent national sovereign state, and so therefore is mutilated at its very outset. So there is also so this pushes us towards sort of rethinking Palestine beyond this kind of national aspiration, as the manifestation on the ground of this national aspiration is proven to be flawed. There is also an ongoingness of colonial violence. That is to say that despite the idea that Palestine has acquired this sort of the feature of a semi or transitional kind of semi-sovereign authority, colonial violence is ongoing. We see everyday processes of dispossession, of removal, of destruction within the West Bank and Gaza, but also in Israel proper, and where we witness the normalization of a process of ethnic cleansing and racial discrimination, particularly emphasized by the approval in Israel of the 2018 Basic State Law that states that Israel is the state of its Jewish citizen primarily. But also the limits of the national comes very much into at the forefront of my elaboration, as Palestine has more and more proven to have become a laboratory for the organization of devices of surveillance and for capital accumulation and profit making, particularly when it comes to which is sort of made very relevant and visible in the proliferation of literature that focuses on the privatization of the occupation and the occupation as a sort of profit-making enterprise, which has global ramifications. Similarly, however, Palestine has also become, as the picture I started my talk with evokes, very central in global struggles for racial, ecological, and social justice. So let me start by, let me continue with my reflection on the kind of operations of settler colonial or Israeli settler colonial policies in Palestine, which have mainly, as in continuity with other settler colonial contexts, have had to do with removal and disappearance of indigenous life. So in Palestine, like in many other settler colonial contexts, from Australia to Canada and elsewhere, and obviously North America, the United States, the elimination of the indigenous population rested on more than just physical displacement, destruction, and ecological alteration. Settler colonialism drew an equivalence between indigenous life and non-life, with humans and non-humans together fossilized or desertified by the ongoing settler colonial project, which aimed at turning the settlers into the new indigenous. So nature was assigned, and this is the work I've been trying to develop with other colleagues in an article that has appeared few months ago. So nature was assigned the ontological status of nature with a capital N only when appropriated by the settlers and when it has been transformed into what we define as settler nature. So decolonial approach in this context has enabled to foreground this new nature-human entanglement as crucial for understanding the operations, but also, as we will see later, the instability of colonial or settler colonial power. So in this recent strand of my work, I've been trying to kind of interrogate what I define as the afterlife of nature and the kind of fractures and openings that become legible by paying attention to this afterlife. And obviously this will be elaborated upon in a minute. And finally, the third strand that I would like to kind of focus on in bringing together the way in which the colonial thinking has helped us to reposition Palestine is the way in which Palestine has become central in global justice struggles. So the black-white checkered kufiya, which I've started my talk with the picture of the baby born at Standing Rock, acts, I would argue, as a signifier of how Palestine is more than a national liberation project and operates today as an analytic, as Palestinian activist and scholar Lubi Kutami argues, an analytic of contemporary manifestations of the coloniality of power. Continuing to inspire and be inspired by anti-colonial struggles and actualizing the historical legacy of internationalism, Palestine also operates as a lens to detect racialized systems of exploitation, dispossession, and surveillance effected today through a global regime. I would like here to point to what Angela Davis and Cornel West in the well-known book called or described in terms of the constant struggle, which is a notion that points to these sort of continuities between the Palestine struggle and other struggles for racial and social justice, which points to the convergence of movements such as anti-colonial, Black, indigenous, and abolitionist movements and peoples whose grievances are similarly rooted in the structural violence of Western colonial modernity. This long premise leads me to kind of situate my talk more clearly in the question of decolonization and decolonizing. And obviously, I'm sure that by the third day, the work of Annibal Qujiano and Walter Mignolo has featured predominantly in the discussions, but obviously the framing I'm using here is Annibal Qujiano's notion of the coloniality of power, which is in his definition, a spatial articulation of power that has been constitutive of modernity since the 16th century Atlantic trade, and which points very importantly to the fact that independence doesn't end colonialism, and therefore points to the very important issue or kind of central ethos of decolonial thinking, which is about the fact that modernity continues to be about the production of colonial differences and continues to be about the exploitation and racialization of Black and brown bodies across settler colonial contexts and their transformation into liberal democracies. And obviously, together with the coloniality of power, we have the notion of the coloniality of knowledge, which is to say that modernity and rationality is the lexicon or the kind of knowledge production that accompanied this ongoingness of colonialism. Most crucially for my talk, and here I want to focus particularly on this because it will become very pertinent in the next few slides. Settler colonialism and this kind of ongoingness of coloniality rests on a radical absence of the other, which is crucial yesterday as today in the self-constitution of the colonial identity. Another highly inspiring line of thought is Walter Mignolo's notion of the epistemic delinking, or the need of an epistemic delinking from the rhetorics of modernity, which obviously also have very much to do with the nation state or decolonization as acquiring the shape of an independent nation state, which I'm going to try and also deconstruct in what follows. So what does it mean to think about Palestine through a decolonizing lens? What does it mean also to think of Palestine via global racial and justice struggles? First of all, as I've already argued, it's sort of a call to think beyond the binary of colonialism and national independence, which has proven, as I just argued, to be a mutilated and flawed project for the reasons I've tried to briefly outline earlier. So what does a decolonial framework inspired by the work of Qujiano and others offer? First of all, it clearly sets the stage for thinking of Palestine as one of the most visible present-day manifestation of the coloniality of power. But also, it allows us to think, as I like to argue in different talks in the last few months, about Palestine, or thinking about Palestine through Standing Rock and Ferguson. And what I mean by that is that I think that there are two main new, or as I will show, not so new framings that have helped the scholarship on Palestine, as well as the struggle for liberation in Palestine, to evolve or to rethink itself as an anti-colonial struggle rather than a struggle for national independence. And one of these kind of tropes or kind of dimensions is the dimension of indigeneity, which has allowed, which Standing Rock evokes, which has allowed to think Palestine as a struggle to claim indigeneity, which expands as a struggle the imaginaries of liberation beyond liberal nation-state promises. And it allows to tether Palestine to other indigenous and struggles around the world. But also the race as a prism through which to understand the kinds of hierarchies which are, as a lot of work has been focusing on more recently in the context of Palestine, which have always been racial hierarchies between Jews and Arabs, and which have been foundational to the constitution of Israel as an independent nation state. So, for example, think for those of you who are familiar with the work on Palestine, we can think of the work of laboring bodies by Ben Zeev, or most crucially, the work of sociologist Lana Tatur on citizenship and settler colonialism, among others. Tatur's work in particular, I would like to focus on briefly, looks at the formation of citizenship in settler colonial contexts, including in Israel, and allows to put under deep scrutiny the ideal of equality afforded by the myth of the nation state, and obviously its parallel myth, which is the myth of equal citizenship. As Lana herself has argued by referring to the logic of profit and dispossession at Standing Rock and elsewhere, and I quote, "While overlapping at times, domination and exclusion are not the same. Exclusion is one form of domination, and inclusion doesn't necessarily mean the end of domination." And of course, we are clearly invited here to think about the racial, sort of the situation of indigenous or Black and brown bodies, or indigenous and Black bodies in the United States and other settler colonial / liberal democracies today. Like in the US or Australia, in Israel too, citizenship has operated to normalize domination and to naturalize settler sovereignty. And it did so by classifying populations, producing differences, and excluding, racializing, and eliminating indigenous people. This is like a really important strand that is becoming quite relevant in a recent set of research in Palestine and in Palestine scholarship, which has really helped to understand the stakes of settler colonialism and to unmask the kind of fallacies of the myth of citizenship that Israel has so often mobilizes upon to argue for its self-ascribed notion of being the only democracy in the Middle East. So inserting race as a crucial prism to understand the nature and complexity of oppression in Israel-Palestine, and as a constitutive element of the coming into being of the State of Israel, has been really crucial and instrumental, and also allows us to tether Palestine to other contexts such as Ferguson. And I mean, I can elaborate a little bit more on this maybe in the Q&A later on. Now, there are other inspirations and genealogies that I draw upon in my thinking and in my kind of, which today I consider sort of a thinking out loud together, really. And again, I want to pay kind of some attention and recognition to the work of other Palestinian scholars that have been engaging with this rethinking of Palestine in the light of what I've been just saying. So, for example, colleagues Kabaha and others at the University of An-Najah in Nablus, who have been really at the forefront in recent years of thinking through, what a decolonizing lens can afford Palestine with in a set of articles and books. The work of Stephen Salaita, particularly a book that was published in 2016, titled Internationalism, Decolonizing Native American Palestine, but also a recent edited collection by Leila Farsah titled Rethinking Palestinian Statehood, Self-Determination and Decolonization Beyond Partition, which again takes us into the stakes in reconsidering Palestine from a project of self-determination through national liberation to or invite to go beyond the logic of partition as the only logic for liberation. But also, sort of more widely, the work of Hamid Dabashi, who invites us to think about a liberation geography, which, I quote, helps us to remap the world beyond its colonial contortions and pushes us to dismantle the frontier fictions that have foreclosed their future and offer alternative modalities of post-national solidarity and alliance. And last but not least, and of course the list can be very long, but I chose to sort of limit to a few important work that have been highly instrumental in my own reflection. The work of Judith Butler on dispossession and the invitation to think beyond liberal notion of possessive nationalism towards what she calls a non-possessive form of national determination that is not premised or should not be premised on the logic of sort of individual liberal ownership of land, of property. So an imaginary where repossession invites a horizon of collective ownership that doesn't rest on individual liberal myths of sort of accumulation. So all these kind of help me to, or invite me to kind of see the importance of decolonial thinking, but also of non-liberal, non-nationalist thinking in reconfiguring the project of Palestinian liberation. Now, going more into the question of the parallels and intersections, which will, in fact, I'm sorry to say this was a kind of very long premise to let me enter into the nitty-gritty of my talk, which focuses on, as the title evoked, the politics of presence and the multiple meanings that these politics of presence can have in Palestine and elsewhere. Let me start, however, by kind of dwelling on what I call sort of the parallels and intersections between Palestine and the predicament of Native Americans, which has been, which is not, and I want to focus here on the fact that this is not a new sort of a new kind of engagement. And I'm highly inspired here by very famous, or what others have defined, a living legend, really, or not living anymore, because it's what I'm talking about is the late poet Mahmoud Darwish, who in the 90s wrote a very influential, however, not so a poem that has remained somehow in the shadow until recently, but which I consider very influential and important, which title is The Red Indian's Penultimate Speech to the White Man, which was part of a collection titled 11 Planets and the End of the Andalusian Scene. And in this work, Mahmoud Darwish refers to, or the poem itself is inspired by the speech of the indigenous chief Duwamish, or better known as the chief Seattle speech, which was delivered, it is believed, in 1854 in response to the treaty of the American government sanctioning the buying of Native Americans' land. And the poem is actually really interesting because it kind of points to the fact that these kind of parallels and intersections were very much part and parcel of key figures of the national or of the Palestine liberation movement for some time, but have been kind of sidelined by the semantics or lexicon of national liberation as a nation-state project. So there is in this poem, The Red Indian's Penultimate Speech to the White Man, a clear endorsement of a parallel between Palestinians and indigenous peoples in North America. There is also a very moving and evocative critique to settler colonial appropriation, which is highly inspired by Seattle's speech. I have actually some of some quotes from the poem, but I would not bore you with my very bad recital technique. So, but I invite you to sort of, if you're interested, to go and read the poem itself, which is really of an extraordinary actuality, really, in thinking about sort of issues of extinction and nature-human relation. However, what is important for us is to kind of reflect on the kind of legacies that have been sidelined, but have been actually quite central in key figures of Palestinian knowledge production for some time. There is in Said's, sorry, I keep saying Said, but it's Mahmoud Darwish poem, a focus on the kind of nature-human entanglement, on the sacredness of the land, which he defines as a kind of sacredness that is very different from the self-ascribed divine mandate to conquer and possess land of the colonizer. Which kind of also takes us to the contemporary times as we move on. For example, again the Standing Rock scene, where the Lakota spiritual leader Leonard Crow Dog argued in response to some white American land activists that went to apologize for the extraction and dispossession of the past 100 years, argued, we don't own the land owns us. So there is already in the 90s, in the writing of Mahmoud Darwish, a very clear situating of Palestine in relation to Native Americans, and a very clear parallel that is drawn between the way that the Palestinian indigenous people consider the land, and an invitation to think of the land not in terms of possessing and repossessing in kind of individualist liberal terms, but in terms of the land being a wider spiritual, cosmological kind of context for rethinking really the relationship between human and nature, which is a very different project than sort of the redemption patriotic project of the settler colonials settling in Palestine and elsewhere. And here I want to kind of dwell very briefly on the point that indigeneity is a very different epistemological positioning than that of exclusionary nativism. There is also in Palestinian, there is a long-term, I would say, amount of thinking and within Palestinian intellectual trajectories, from Edward Said to Elias Sambar and others, on the ways in which the project of liberation for Palestinians doesn't rest on a myth of exclusionary nativism. I would invite you to, for example, think about Elias Sambar's notion or critique to the anteriority thesis, his critique to the idea that, we have been here first, and to the idea that identity has a date from where it starts. Obviously, this is a whole topic, from exile to sort of the work of Palestinian intellectual Edward Said on exile, but also Mahmoud Darwish, Elias Sambar, and others, which I don't have the time to go into, but I wanted to point to this important kind of question of the difference between indigenous thinking and nativism. Now, let me go back to the question that I've mentioned at the beginning around disappearance and the politics of presence. Here again, I'm kind of looking back into the genealogies of this, of the coming into being of this frame for thinking of liberation, the indigeneity frame. I'm reminded of an interview that Elias Sambar, a Palestinian intellectual, and Gilles Deleuze had, which was published in 1998, first in Libération and then in an academic outlet called Discourse, where Gilles Deleuze is talking to Elias Sambar about the coming into being of this new review, the Revue of Etudes Palestiniennes, which was given birth in Paris, and which title of the whole sort of interview is The Red Indians of Palestine. And Elias Sambar is in this interview with Gilles Deleuze argues, and I quote, "We are also the American Indians of the Jewish settlers in Palestine. In their eyes, our one and only role consisted in disappearing. In this, it is certain that the history of the establishment of Israel reproduces the process which gave birth to the United States of America." So the insistence, or here what I want to focus on is really this notion of how disappearing, or the kind of the possibility or the constitutive element of the settler nation state is or rests upon the ability to make the indigenous disappear from sight. And obviously, the disappearance means is more than a kind of material process of erasure and dispossession, is a kind of positioning, is a kind of crucial cultural, epistemological kind of process of thinking or self-making for the settler colonial. So in fact, thinking about the Zionist movement mobilized, as I will elaborate upon in a minute, it mobilized the Jewish community in Palestine, even the pre-existing Jewish community, with the idea that the country was empty. And as Elias Sambar argues in this interview with Gilles Deleuze, in order for this disappearance to succeed, it had to function from the start as if it had already taken place, which is to say, by never seeing the existence of the other, who was indisputably present all the same. Again, this is really crucial, I think, because the question of the politics of seeing or the politics of presence acquires a very important meaning in the light of the politics of disappearance that the settler colonial movement has enacted. In his work on Palestine as metaphor, again, Mahmoud Darwish argues that in this resistance to disappearing, obviously for Mahmoud Darwish, poetry is crucial, is a sort of crucial language for remaining present. But remaining present, in his words, is to be the mastery of the story. The master of the story is the road to victory. So poetry allows naming the history or the past, and naming is actually existence, because without name or without naming, there is void, there is absence. So this is what Mahmoud Darwish refers to when he talks about poetry or Palestine as metaphor within his poetry, because poetry confers, or Palestine as metaphor confers to Palestine in the face of colonial erasure, a sense of presence. And a sense of presence that doesn't just look back at the past in terms of nostalgia, but brings back the past in order to save or to think of the future in novel ways. And most interestingly, I think in this volume where Mahmoud Darwish also reflects on the parallel and intersections between the Palestinian question and Native Americans, is when he talks about the idea of return, again, going back to the question of nativism or repossession. And he argues that Palestinians can't return. First of all, because Palestinians have never left the land, in that thinking of Palestine as a metaphor affords us with a continuous presence. But also, as he argues, we don't return, we arrive, as return to the past is not possible. And this is, I think, a clear anti-nativist stance. There is no return to the past. There is always also the kind of naming and tracing of the past for thinking about the future. And this kind of takes me to other parallels and intersections. Again, when going back to one of the key definitions that I opened my talk with, which is the notion of survivance. And survivance is a notion that was coined by Gerald Wiesenor in his attempt to think very complex and multifaceted scholarship, attempting to think about the relationship or the way in which sort of thinking of Native Americans and the genocide of Native Americans, we are kind of led to kind of either think that there has been a process of survival, but no resistance, and in this through this term, Wiesenor points to something that lies between survival and resistance. It's not just resistance, but it's not pure survival, it's survivance. And how survivance is defined is an active sense of presence over historical erasure. Or, again, survivance as an interrupted or lasting life, which has to do with names, narratives that are continuously present beyond the kind of allure of nostalgia or essentialism, and beyond simple and mere sort of the position of the victim. There is obviously also a native aesthetics, and obviously the book is a very complex, multifaceted, as I argued, but very important, I think, to kind of consider when thinking about really the vexed question of, existing and resisting, or survival or resistance. And I think the notion of survivance as interrupted or lasting life, which produces a fracture in the kind of project of domination and victory, is I think really important, very interesting, and evocative of the Palestinian predicament as well. But what I'm interested in this kind of notion of the native aesthetics and the kind of the presence and the multiple ways in which presence acts as a site of struggle, really. So in the second part of my talk, or in what remains of the time I have for this talk, I want to kind of take you to think with me about the ways in which survivance as a kind of heuristic device to think about sort of the positioning or of the struggles of Palestinians and other indigenous populations in different contexts is about. It is about sort of surviving and resisting in an intertwined way. And the kind of survivance that I want to talk about takes on three different dimensions. There is a native presence or a politics of presence of an indigenous nature, human or /human entanglement, which keeps being recalcitrant to its elimination in Palestine. There is presence as a space of appearance, to use Hannah Arendt's notion of appearing to one another as a precondition of politics. So the idea, as sort of the picture I used at the beginning, that making visible also the connections across places and spaces of global struggles takes on an aesthetic dimension that is, I think, very crucial issue in the politics of resistance today. But there is also a politics of presence in the formation of new alliances, the formation and emergence of new political horizons, which Angela Davis, in her famous elaboration, has defined as the intersectionality of struggles. Now, let me just focus on the first of these three dimensions and look at how, or look at one dimension of the operation of settler colonialism in Palestine by taking you into this long quote that has been, which I think is very important in highlighting the kind of stakes and the kind of politics of erasure that I've been talking about so far. And I'm here quoting, or quoting extensively from the book of Meron Benvenisti, Sacred Landscapes, which has a quote from Joseph Weitz, who was in charge of the transfer committees in Palestine between 1937 and 1948. And he was in charge of resolving what was defined as the Arab problem in those years. So the quote starts, and it's taken by the diary of Joseph Weitz. And I'll take you with you in reading this quote. And the road continues eastward between mountains and over mountains, and the Galilee is revealed to me in its splendor, its hidden places and folds, its crimson smile and its green softness and its desolation. I have never seen it like this. It was always bustling with man and beast, and the latter predominated. Herds and more herds used to descend from the heights to the valleys of the stream beds, their bells ringing with a sort of discontinued sound, which vanished in the ravines and hid among the crevices, as if they would go on chiming forever, and the shepherds striding after them like figures from ancient times, whistling merrily and driving the goats towards the trees and bushes, to gnaw at them hungrily. And now the picture has disappeared and is no more. A strange stillness lies over all the mountains and is drawn by hidden threads from within the empty villages. An empty village, what a terrible thing. Fossilized lives, lives turned into fossils, whispers in extinguished ovens, a shattered mirror, moldy blocks of dried figs and a scrawny dog, thin-tailed and floppy-eared and dark-eyed. At the same time, at the very same moment, a different feeling throbs and rises from the primordial depths, a feeling of victory, of taking control, of revenge, and of casting off suffering. And suddenly the whispers vanish and you see empty houses, good for the settlements of our Jewish brethren, who have wandered for generations upon generations, refugees of your own people, steeped in suffering and sorrow, as they at last find a roof over their heads. And you knew the war, this was our war. I think there cannot be a more significant and evocative except to kind of signify the kind of erasure, fossilization, disappearance of the indigenous life word that settler colonialism has enacted. But let me linger over a few more elements here, or kind of see what the relevance of this quote is for the wider scheme of things of this presentation today. First of all, in the logic of the logic of disappearance, there is a kind of evocation of Palestine as an empty land, Palestine as an ancestral and primordial kind of context, devoid of its native population. A fossilized landscape, which is also filled with a deadly silence, a burnt and shriveled place, which becomes fossilized. And obviously, as we know, the evocation here is with reference to the sort of 400 villages that were destroyed and razed to to ground in 1948 when the State of Israel came into being, and the ethnic cleansing that followed with the coming into birth of the refugee question for Palestinians. But it is precisely this destruction and erasure, this fossilization, that is actually transposed into the well-known Zionist slogan of a land without a people for a people without a land. So extinction here really is in reference to the extinction of nature and the ethnic cleansing on the native population, which becomes in Joseph Weit's rendition a non-fact. In an instant, he argues, the fact is no more, the place is no more, and victory is achieved. But what is important really is also the ways in which sort of different and hierarchical and racialized conceptions of nature come into existence in this portrayal, and how important it is to consider how constitutive of Zionism these different conceptions of nature are. So nature is not even an ontological given. There isn't a human nature divide here. But as Elisabeth Povinelli argues or invites us to think with her notion of geonto power, colonial power is about the ability to draw a distinction between life and non-life, which is an arbitrary self-assigned power. So the extinction that we're talking about here, similarly to the extinction of Native Americans, which will now then lead us to the contemporary times, is the extinction of the indigenous life world or nature indigenous kind of entanglement that gets to be made extinct in the settler colonization of the land. Theodore Herz, for example, argued that if I wish to substitute a new building for a new one, for an old one, I must demolish before I construct. And here again, very briefly, I would like to point to the kind of technological imaginary of settler colonial domination in Palestine, which has so many parallels with the settler colonial endeavor of the North America, the Americas. So here, Theodore Herzl, founding father of the State of Israel, talks about his vision for the land and his kind of modernist visions with sort of the land being reshaped thanks to great chemical industries, which could be established on the shores of the highly sulfurous Dead Sea. The idea of penetrating territory through a futuristic imaginary, and there is sort of an ethic of redemption of settlers through the displaying of technological progress, and which rests upon the elimination of the native agrarian system, which is very prominent for anyone who wants to kind of, or who is interested in going beyond the kind of environmental ethic that Israel presents as very crucial in its relationship to land. It actually is settler colonialism in Palestine very much resembles and rests on notions of modernist expropriation and appropriation of land through a violent desacralization, I would argue, of the land in with a view to civilization and technological progress, which kind of takes me to a really important and interesting work that is the work of indigenous scholar and activist Nick Est, especially one of his latest books called How Our History is the Future, which also plays around the ongoingness and the kind of the notion of survivance as continuous presence, the history and the future, and the past, the present, and the future. which is a reflection on settler colonialism in the Americas and in North America today, and the indigenous resistance that has been taking place since the mid 2015 onwards, and which again evokes some really important parallelisms. First of all, in this book, Nick argues and shows eloquently how settler colonialism, but this is not new, rested upon the elimination and replacement of the native population with a new population of settlers that, as many others have argued, from the late Patrick Wolf to Lorenzo Veracini, is the exact project of settler colonialism, that is to say, transforming the settlers into the new indigenous. But it also points, as the title shows, sort of to the temporality of settler colonial violence, and that is to say, the ongoingness of violence and the ongoingness of expropriation across human and non-human life forms, and the negation of the kind of indigenous entanglement that is at stake in settler colonialism. And most importantly, takes us to a reflection about how, in fact, the elimination of the native in the Americas rested upon, the elimination of their non-human world, and in particular the Buffalo genocide, which reduced to hunger, of course, entire indigenous tribes. But most importantly, or most interestingly, in terms of sort of our drawing of some parallels here, is the reference to the 1950s and 1960s construction on the Missouri River of a dam, which required the displacement of some 70% of the native population for the production of hydroelectricity, which I think very much echoes, or the vice versa, the sort of Theodore Herzl's earlier evocation of the construction of the dam and the sort of horsepower and hydro-futuristic imaginaries of sort of redeeming the land into, or redeeming the desert into a garden. So there are parallelisms that do not only engage our sort of the cultural and poetic and aesthetic dimensions, but also the material type of appropriation and dispossession. But as I argued, I want to take you briefly to kind of think about the afterlife or the survivance, to think with Gerald Wiesener, by sort of referring to work in Palestinian scholarship that has focused on land and memory and past and present and future, and how sort of the process of walking over the land even, or the process of walking, as Reja Sheda, a Palestinian intellectual, has argued in some of his work and in some of his literary production, the process of walking on a vanishing landscape does not only entail traces of a past memory, but also enacts our senses to a sort of future imagination of what can be. So this is like a picture of some of the ruins that rest of some of the Palestinian villages in today's Israel. And here you can see sort of the ruins, and the ruins are surrounded by the popping up of native vegetation that keeps popping up despite the fossilization that has been attempted. So there is a lot of really evocative and interesting insights when thinking about what this kind of afterlife allows or affords us with. And this afterlife, the continuous, uninterrupted survivance, or what I would call ecological ruin or ruination as the process of nature or insurgent nation or unruly nature produces new visions for what the land could be or could become, and what kind of new entanglements this resurgent vegetation calls upon. So there is a sense in which, for instance, and here you can see also some pictures of taken from a very interesting website called Palestine Remembered, which is a platform for Palestinians who want to upload pictures of those who are able or who were able to travel to the sites of the ruins of their villages. They can upload pictures of the meanings that these journeys or these returns or these arrivals, to use Mahmoud Darwish notion, have for them, and how the kind of resurgent vegetation invites, which has continued, as I argued, to research, to be born on the sites of the ruins, what kind of new horizons it invites to think through. And here, for example, I have worked a lot with refugees on these imaginaries, on the meanings they assign to their own notion of native presence. For instance, the idea that when Israel had shriveled to the ground entire Palestinian villages, and at the time when, for certain villages, it was still possible to visit, Palestinian refugees who would go back to their villages of origin would be prevented from obviously inhabiting the villages themselves, because the reason why the villages were erased and razed to the ground was precisely to curtail return. So these refugees started to work with the land instead. And since Israel had transformed the land from settlement land to agricultural land, the popping up of agriculture or of vegetation prompt new ways of engaging with the land, which kind of, I think, invites us to think about the instability of the settler colonial project and the constant fractures that can emerge thanks to kind of this entanglement of nature-human that keeps being alive, or keeps its presence. Finally, thinking again through Mahmoud Darwish and going back to the sort of more aesthetic or poetic rendition of these parallelisms between Palestinians and as indigenous, or between Palestinians and Native Americans. And I would like to take you to a quote in which Mahmoud Darwish reflects on these Native American legacies in this book, Palestine as Metaphor. And he argues, and I quote, "For the Palestinian, the earth doesn't only enter into politics, but also into the sacred. Since my beginnings in poetry, I address the earth and its elements, grass, trees, chopped wood, stones, as living creatures. I want to say that everything was preparing me to receive the message of the Native American. Having had knowledge of its culture, I realized that he spoke of me better than I spoke of myself. And I'm proud of having raised the reivindication of our rights to the level of the struggle of the Native American for his rights. It's a defense of the harmony of the universe and of nature, a harmony that the white man has interrupted by his behavior." Now, I know that Professor Chun has sent me a reminder, but I would just like to take 5 minutes to come to an end, if that's possible, by going on the sort of last few minutes to kind of reflect on the third point of my kind of line of thinking today, which is the reconfiguration of Palestine through from a national liberation project via indigeneity to a central knot in what Angela Davis has defined as the intersectionality of struggles. And I want to point to the fact that, as the picture at the beginning has kind of pointed to, we are witnessing the emergence, or more than the emergence, the revitalization of an internationalist legacy, which today can be more aptly called defined in terms of sort of an intersectional site of struggle, which rests upon a web of alliances with multiple organizations across the globe, from sort of, and in particular, I'm focusing here on the relationship again to what's going on in North America. So the relationship with the Malcolm X grassroots movements, the Black Lives Matter movement, the Colectivo Zapatista, Filipino, Chicano, and Native indigenous organizations, and Palestine and Palestinian activists, which is a web of alliance that is very much enacted through a politics of presence. And here I go back to my initial title, which is a politics of presence, which plays a crucial political role against disappearance and violent removal, but which also makes visible what Angela Davis defined as this kind of intersectionality of struggle. And the visibility here has a twofold meaning. On the one hand, sort of there is what Gerald Wiesenor defines in terms of the native aesthetic presence against disappearance, but also in the other meaning of making visible the connections or the coloniality of power that we discussed earlier on. And to use Angela Davis' word, and I quote, "When we see the police repressing protests in Ferguson, we also have to think about the Israeli police and the Israeli army repressing protests in occupied Palestine." So Angela Davis, obviously, I think, is one of the four sort of most important, I would argue, activist scholar who is at the forefront of not only participating into, but making visible the historical, political, and socioeconomic connections between settler colonial projects, or the continuum between settler colonial contexts and liberal democracies. And obviously inserting heavily in the frame a very important intersectional thinking. So I would like to end now, since I can see that time is really up, by with this picture of Palestinians and Palestinian activists from the Palestinian Youth Movement, which is a grassroots global youth movement that I've, together with some colleagues, spent some time doing research on, enacting their presence at the Standing Rock site of protest back in 2016, and raising sort of the Palestinian flag at the site, together with Lakota and Nakota peoples, in protest of the expansion of the pipelines that has been notably continuing, unfortunately, instead of being halted in recent times. And I think I'll put an end to the agony of Professor Chun, who has been repeatedly telling me time is up, by ending with this note. Thank you very much.
Into our break, and the next session will start in less than half an hour. So we do want to give people a chance to ask questions. If we can quickly collect them, and then give her a chance to respond.
Yeah, thank you very much for your presentation. I've learned so many things through it. But since time is quite short, I will just go I wanted to know if your parallel or your theoretical framework with the coloniality of power, referring to Annibal Qujiano, Arturo Escobar, is not a little bit limitative to the question at stake, because the coloniality of power addresses a situation, the continuity of colonialism from after independence and from modernity that starts from Renaissance, from the 15th century. Whereas my understanding of the situation in Palestine and Israel predates the Roman and even Greek civilization, given that it starts with monotheism. It is a religious, at the core of it, according to my understanding, it is a religious problem. And so I was wondering if alluding to indigeneity and also coloniality of power doesn't weaken the problem as at stake. Thank you.
Thank you, Ruba, for shedding light on the most prominent colonial case within the last 70 years. The case which is rarely discussed here, even though colonialism and post-colonialism are regularly discussed. I think post-colonial studies might have something to gain from looking at the history of Zionist and Zionist discourse. And my question in this regard is, what is your reflection on the phenomenon of the Israeli new historians, As you know, this phenomena appeared in 1980s, and they carry a new perspective that undermined the traditional narratives of Zionism, and it boomed in 1990s until in the year 2000, and after 2000 it sharply declined. And NPP called about 1990s the moment of grace, and after 2000 and the collapse of the peace process and the electing of the Ariel Sharon, this phenomena declined sharply. Some say this phenomena is part of bigger movement, which is post-Zionism. Post-Zionism in Israeli society and academia discuss many topics like history, identity, discrimination within the Israeli society between Sephardim and Ashkenazi, and the Holocaust survivals and other issues. But the people who discussed and focused on the treating Palestinian people called the new historians. My question is, what is the relationship between post-colonialism and post-Zionism? And before that, we need to ask that question: does post-Zionism even exist? Thank you.
We have one historical, one contemporary, so we'll let her resolve everything in between.
Sorry, do you want me to start answering?
So you can respond to the questions. Okay. You respond.
Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you very much for two really important questions, and for which allow me actually to kind of clarify or dwell upon some of the issues that probably I skewed through quite quickly. And the first question is whether the coloniality of power or Annibal Qujiano's and sort of the new framework, or new, not anymore new, but of decolonial thinking is the apt framework for thinking of Palestine today and past. And the question referred to sort of an interpretation of the conflict that is proposed as a religious conflict. Well, the first thing I want to say is that the reason why I think the decoloniality of power framework is very important is that the Palestine-Israel conflict, first of all, is not a religious conflict, although it's some observers and scholars like to present it that way. It has nothing to do with a religious conflict insofar as, Palestine has always been inhabited by Jewish, Christian, and Muslim civilizations and communities. And it is only in the sort of the mandate and post-mandate and period that, and with the kind of coming into existence of the state of Israel in 1948, that this kind of type of coexistence becomes curtailed, and so the conflict is a conflict over land, and is a conflict over, like in many other settler colonial contexts, it is about erasing the indigenous population and replacing it with a new population of settlers. And this project itself rests upon a deep and ingrained racialized understanding of and constructions of identities across Jewish and Arabs. So why is this important? Because I think for a long time we have kind of, particularly across the world, but also within the Palestine scholarship, espoused the idea that the conflict was a conflict between two national aspirations over the same land. So, but the opposite is true, is that there is one project, which is Zionism, which aims at making the settlers into the indigenous population. And for that, it requires the erasure of, as I tried to show, of the indigenous life world. Whereas on the other hand, the population that was there, because the country wasn't empty as Zionists would have it, as I tried to show, the population who was there is not claiming simply, or is no longer claiming simply to have a state, and therefore is no longer simply, and this is like the core of, or the bulk of my talk, is not simply kind of referring to the metaphysics of the nation state as the paradigm for liberation, but is fully engaging and fully inhabiting the legacies of the internationalist and indigenous struggles, which are actualized today in this active presence over sites of struggle, but it has also been present in the past, and that's where I was referring to Mahmoud Darwish and the poetic and intellectual trajectories that have established sort of the similarities and parallel intersections between these contexts, which I think is very important because it points to the fact that the horizon for liberation has changed from one where we are claiming for a state with all its myths, in which case, Israel can claim that, they have given citizenship to Palestinians in Israel and that they are a democratic state. The problem is that they are not, because even within Israel, and despite the granting of so-called citizenship to Palestinians in Israel, Palestinians continue to be second-class citizens, to say the least. They continue to be nearly sort of they continue to be segregated in Arabs-only areas. They are they make it very difficult to build or to expand on Palestinian cities. They have they don't, you know, they're not not only there is no integration, but the fake integration or the feeble integration that is at stake is a way to kind of discipline or govern or the Palestinian presence in Israel. So I think that once established that this is not a religious conflict, but it's a conflict over land, like in many other settler colonial contexts, and once established that there is an ongoingness to the colonial violence beyond, after, in between and across the various mutations of national state formations in the land, which includes the formation of the State of Israel, the formation of the Palestine or the Palestinian National Authority, which include the sort of all the kind of manifestations of mutilated projects of independence that we are dealing with so far. What we are left with is to kind of really pick up the legacies of these internationalist and intersectional types of liberation horizons and political practices, to rethink what returning or arriving or possessing the land means in a framework that is, I think, today very urgent, particularly in the light of sort of the extinction we all face as a result of settler colonial exploitation and its multiple multiple forms of, you know, land expropriation and profit making that we see at place in different places of the world. So I think precisely for these reasons, for this multiplicity of reasons, the coloniality of power framework is a very apt framework for relocating or repositioning Palestine in today, both politically and intellectually. The second question obviously raises so many different points, and I'm not sure whether I'll be able to give justice to all the points that you raised. But definitely, I think that there has been a backlash against the new historians' rereading of history, particularly the very important strand that kind of unleashed or unveiled the sort of the myths of the State of Israel as or that have accompanied the State of Israel narrative, that this, first of all, this was a land without a people for a people without a land, and secondly that the extinction and razing to the ground and ethnic cleansing of the local population or indigenous population and nature was an accidental result of, you know, the war, and the new historians kind of showed very well that also thanks to collaboration with Palestinian scholars, showed that it was a premeditated and in line and in continuity with other settler colonial contexts, the ethnic cleansing and erasure of the indigenous life force was constitutive of the coming into being of the settler colonial project in Palestine. So I think it was a very important program and project. And as you say, today we are faced with a backlash and a sort of, which comes under multiple names. On the one hand, you have sort of some you know, scholars or people who claim that this is a post-Zionist situation, and others who claim that this is a situation where sort of I mean, in some ways, I do think that Zionism is faced with its internal constitutive flaws and contradictions. And I think we've been seeing some of it in the recent implosion that the recent demonstrations in Palestine, in Israel, have kind of brought to the fore. That is to say, it's imploding around its own contradictions and its own modalities of operation, if you wish, because the idea that thousands of people go, take to the streets to protest against a reform of the legal system, which might expose them to their human rights crimes, is kind of a convoluted and very complex mirror to the implosion of the project itself in some ways. There are also signs that the way in which Zionism has taken on a very right-wing or extreme nativist and I would argue racial extreme racist.
I'm sorry to interrupt. But another session will start in less than 5 minutes. So
okay,
we really
fine.
do have to conclude. But I do appreciate your answers to these questions.
My answer is that I think that to some degree there is a post and there are some new dimensions that we need to pay attention to, but that doesn't mean that Zionism has ended. So yeah, thank you very much.